Sometimes, people want wrestling to be more like film, more like superheroes. Others want wrestling to be presented as more of a sport. The fictional nature of wrestling combined with real-world athletes create a unique environment that offers some unique quandaries. And just one of those questions is, does wrestling have a protagonist? Is the key to writing good wrestling the same as writing any other fictional work, where it needs to have a well-defined lead? Is the key to having a good main event all in having a good main character? Well, that's the topic of this episode, as we examine these terms and what they could mean for wrestling. Because today, Dave knows if wrestling should have a protagonist. Movies, TV shows, plays, novels, comic books. Stories all tend to have something in common, with their narratives being carried out through what's known as a protagonist. Now, sometimes people refer to this as the main character or the hero of the story, but these terms aren't necessarily always the same. I mean, we know what a hero is, someone who saves a cat out of a tree or saves a baby from a burning building, but there are plenty of stories told from the villain's perspective or have main characters that are not heroic in nature. And of course, in terms of wrestling, just look at Ric Flair or Gorgeous George. So don't immediately think that a protagonist has to be a babyface. And even better yet, what about anti-heroes? Movies and wrestling have their fair share of those too. Come on, just see Stone Cold Steve Austin for a great example. Alright, so if a protagonist isn't a hero necessarily, then what is a protagonist? Well, let's just break down the word. Protagonist comes from two Greek words, protos, meaning first in importance, and agonistes, meaning actor, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing either of those right, so. Now with that being said, it is fair to say that protagonist means lead actor, which is definitely not the same thing as main character. Sure, they usually are one and the same, but one is a designation for a fictional character, while the other is a real-life person's job title. So just like in wrestling, we are beginning to see how the lines blur between what is reality and what is scripted. Now, the definitions of main character and protagonist continue to grow even further apart when you consider that another definition of a protagonist is the top performer. So this definitely changes things, because if your best actor is your protagonist, then that tells us that Anakin Skywalker cannot be the protagonist of the Star Wars prequels, even if the prequels are about him becoming Darth Vader. You see my point? Now back onto wrestling. That definition could mean that the best performer is the real protagonist, and this is where things will begin to take shape, especially since yet another definition of protagonist is the best in a contest, or a champion. Knowing that, people who love that AJ Styles won the WWE title over Jinder Mahal begin to make a lot more sense than they already do. Yes, I know, best is subjective, but this does give some clarity as to why audiences react the way they do for certain wrestlers. If the protagonist is the best performer and a protagonist is a champion, then of course fans will root for a wrestler that they deem to be the best to be their champion. It's just common sense, no matter how much WWE tries to fight it. Okay, so let me bring up just one more point before I drive this all home, with a new term that I came across in an article while doing research for this video, and that's main character syndrome. Now yes, this definitely applies to that person at your job that thinks their life should be a movie and that everyone around them is their supporting cast member, but I want to focus on the term as it was when I was first exposed to it. And in that case, main character syndrome was in reference to tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons, which are based off of imagination and teamwork. So therefore, someone who is afflicted with MCS might be a person who comes from the video game world or gets really engrossed into movies and treats a game of D&D like they themselves are the main character and everyone else around them are their sidekicks. And unfortunately for them and those playing with them, these games don't work that way, and this all just ends up ruining everything. Now in either case, I think we can see how this applies to certain people in wrestling, like the McMahons, Stephanie in particular. You can argue that Stephanie's affliction of MCS is harmful to the entire roster. Just look at the women's revolution. The focus is and should be on the female competitors, the wrestlers who are doing the real wrestling. But Stephanie wants to make it all about her, and she steals the spotlight. And that's definitely a problem. Having the focus shifted to the wrong person can be damaging to the entire group. So now finally, the main question. Does wrestling have a protagonist? Okay, now before I ask you to tell me what you think down in the comments, allow me to give my opinion on the subject. Wrestling is unique in so many ways to other forms of entertainment. So as is often the case, it occupies its own set of rules. But first and foremost, it is fiction. I think of wrestling, as different as it may be, as a form of entertainment that's just like film or comic books, and that it should be treated just like any other piece of writing. But I do believe that we need to think and craft craft and criticize wrestling with as much scrutiny and intelligence as we would dedicate to any other form of entertainment. And that is what I do when I look at wrestling. In terms of storytelling, I hold wrestling to the same fundamental principles as I would any other scripted material. So yes, I do think there's a protagonist in wrestling, but I also think that there's more than just one. I prefer multiple protagonists in a company at any one time. Different feuds, different stories all make for a much more interesting show, and therefore require a multitude of different protagonists. And expanding upon that, a factor where I think wrestling benefits over other mediums is the fact that I think protagonists can switch during a feud, for example, like with Stone Cold Steve Austin and Bret the Hitman Hart. Also, in wrestling, one person can be the best performer as a showman while his opponent is the best performer as a wrestler, like with Hogan and Savage. But fine, if wrestling protagonists do exist, then how could someone suffer from main character syndrome? Well, my answer to that is, I think that main character syndrome exists in wrestling and is damaging when someone who is not the main character thinks that they are. Meanwhile, another wrestler actually is. And this is especially sad if there are multiple main characters and yet that person still isn't one of them. And that is exactly what I think the biggest culprit is when it comes to fans being upset over certain wrestlers maintaining the spotlight. John Cena, Roman Reigns. When the narrative of the main event scene calls for someone else, whether it's Wade Barrett during the Nexus Invasion or Daniel Bryan at the Royal Rumble, the wrong guy is going to rub the fans the wrong way. And now, yes, I know it may seem like I'm blurring the lines between protagonist, hero, and main character here, but like I originally said, while all of these do have distinct individual definitions, they do often coincide as well. And that is the ultimate point for me on all of this. In closing, I think we, the fans, choose our protagonists. We decide who we think is the best and therefore who should be our champion. We determine who the best performer is, and that's who gets the gold. But when I say the best, it's only in the right given situation. Whether it's on the mic or in the story or in the ring, the best performer is the guy who is the best, and all those roles may not necessarily all be the same guy. But the importance is that there should always be a story being told in every single match, in every single show. But what do you think? Does wrestling have a protagonist? Let me know down in the comments. And don't forget to check me out on Patreon, just like Shockwave1209. Thank you, Shockwave1209, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and this has been Dave Knows.